So welcome. Tonight's monthly webinar topic is going to be essentially the nutritional management of horses that may have some metabolic disorders. We're really going to focus on one in particular, but you will find there's a lot of commonalities across metabolic diseases when we talk about strategies to manage them. So we'll go ahead and get started. So there are a number of nutritionally related disorders that horses can have. So the ones that I've highlighted here in red are going to have a lot of commonalities in how we might manage them. Although EGUS, equine gastric ulcer syndrome, might even have a few similarities between what we're talking about here as well as some metabolic muscle disorders that have some nutritional components as well. So there's going to be a lot of commonalities, but for time's sake, since our goal is to have a 30-minute webinar, we're going to stick sort of with those big three. So what is the commonality between those? So a lot of it is comes down to some sort of obesity related issues. So our horses today tend to be overfed and a little bit under exercise. So when we think about how horses were historically used, they exercise quite a bit more, and even our time constraints these days prevent us from using them as much as, again, horses were sort of designed to in the past. Also, there's a commonality with the amount of concentrate we're able to give horses with improving in pastures. And essentially feeding practices, we can have some horses that are pretty commonly overweight. Now, certainly there is a genetic component to these disorders, but when we talk about metabolic syndrome and obesity, it's not as simple as a single point mutation in the horse's genome, so we can't send in a genetic test to tell us whether our horse is going to be at risk for these. That would be nice, but we're not quite there yet. And a lot of the focus of what I'm going to talk about tonight is the carbohydrate piece. So all of our insulin resistant horses, metabolic syndrome, and even when they become Cushing's horses, have some sensitivity to carbohydrates. So that's what we'll be talking about tonight. So our goal for this evening is not really to delve into diagnostics. So I do recommend that folks would consult with their veterinarians to actually get some testing done to see if your horse has officially metabolic syndrome. So instead, we're going to focus on strategies for our horse owners that may be struggling with this, talk about carbohydrates a little bit and try to make it a little bit simpler to understand. We'll talk about plant type and what your horses are consuming, as well as some diet considerations for them as well. So let's get started with our topic of the metabolic horses. So commonly, these horses have an issue with being over-conditioned. Now, our PPID horses can lose weight eventually as they get further into the syndrome. But what we start with really are horses that have some obesity issues. So there have been a number of studies that have said commonly horses today can be as much as 1/4 to 1/2% or 50% of the population are overweight. So really these statistics kind of resemble what we see in humans and in a lot of our companion animals as well. So kind of a pervasive problem. We also find that owners may not always realize that their horses may actually be overweight. So commonly owners will underestimate their horse's body condition score and again may not really realize that it's a problem. So when I think it's pretty common when we think about society in general, it's pretty easy for us to recognize when animals are too thin. That's really pretty simple to see as obese. Sorry, not obese, as abuse. But people have a harder time with sort of that lean body type. So our little white dog here on the left, a lot of people would think of this dog as being really underweight, but he's actually pretty fit. So why am I talking about that? Again, I think people tend to skew their reality a little bit more towards animals should be overweight rather than even a lean body type. So while our really thin animals are seen as, oh no, we shouldn't do that, that's really abuse, sometimes we allow animals to get overweight without really realizing the consequences that may be there for their health status. So really want to think about having a lean or moderate body type. So why is that important? When we think about an animal that is overweight, they have essentially extra adipose tissue. So adipose tissue is not really just an inert tissue sitting there storing calories for us to use later, although that's part of its main function, but it actually produces a lot of hormones, a lot of cytokines, and adipokines, and essentially these chemical signals coming from the fat tissue can have a lot of really deleterious effect on our animals. And this is for people too, so we share quite a bit. So it can have issues with insulin sensitivity, it can cause us to have cardiovascular disease. For horses, may also contribute to arthritis, but we really want to talk about this insulin sensitivity piece tonight. So when we think about where animals store fat, that actually may have a significant effect on their health status. So with humans, we're kind of familiar with the idea that we can have pear-shaped or apple-shaped body types, and one is more healthy than the other. So an apple shape in people actually carries with it a greater risk of insulin resistance and metabolic syndrome compared to pear-shaped people. And horses, we actually have the same thing. So we talk about horses that have regional adiposity or store fat in specific locations, put them at greater risk for metabolic syndrome. So for horses, rather than having a pear shape, we do think about visceral fat in sort of abdominal areas around the inguinal region. But for horses, our kind of hallmark area of risk factors actually the crest of their neck. And that actually is the best predictor of horses struggling with metabolic syndrome or insulin resistance. So when we're looking at that, it essentially is a pretty good predictor. So a horse that has a really crusty neck is a pretty good predictor of insulin dysregulation. So in this graph that I have here, they were actually looking at some ponies. And so the number of ponies that had this high crusty neck score were at much, much greater risk of having insulin dysregulation compared to even just normal obese ponies. So definitely want to look to see what does that neck of that horse really look like. So if you're not familiar, there is a way to essentially kind of give a subjective score to the neck of the horse. And really when we start to see horses being at more risk for metabolic syndrome is when we get over that 3. So that 3 in that crusty neck, it's enlarged and thickened. Fat kind of starts to accumulate more in the midsection of the horse's neck here. And you can really sort of grab a hold of it and it doesn't really bend side to side. And then as they get really bad, these 4s and 5s, that can be pretty obvious to horse owners that they're have an abnormality. So there are ways that you can kind of monitor this a little bit. So if owners are looking at their management programs and trying to determine if their horse is getting to a healthier body weight, sometimes body condition score really takes a while to budge. And again, that's a subjective measure. But if you like to have sort of some numbers and monitor your progress in managing your horse, you can actually do a neck circumference of your horse and monitor that over time, and that may give you a little bit better feedback to say, yep, my program here with my horse is actually helping out a little bit. There's also some useful apps that you can buy for your devices that allow you to input some data, some measurements on your horse, and can give you an estimate of whether your horse is overweight and what maybe its ideal body weight should be. So weight loss management. Obviously, we're talking about a commonality, again, between insulin resistance and equine metabolic syndrome. So when we think about losing weight for our horses, we have some goals in mind. So one, we definitely want it to happen. So we don't all have scales, so that's why I recommend using some other tools to monitor your progress. But we also really want to make sure our horse maintains a healthy GI tract. So when we start reducing feed intake, we don't want to tip our horses back over into the problem of having ulcers. So that's going to be a big goal for us when we manage these horses. Also, you just can't cut them off from feed either. We need to make sure they're still consuming the adequate amount of nutrients, such as protein, vitamins, and minerals. So we're not just going to starve our horse. We have to essentially rebalance the diet and try to reduce the calories, but still get the nutrients that they need. And then the other key piece is we want to keep our horses happy, right? So if we reduce all the food from them, we're going to have really, really frustrated horses. And we might end up with frustrated humans as well, because those horses are going to be pretty unhappy because of how hungry they are and looking for other things to do. So we're going to talk about strategies to keep everybody healthy and happy while we're reducing weight. So one option is to increase caloric expenditure from that horse. So that's great if the horse is healthy, but if we're talking about horses with metabolic syndrome, they may also have some concurrent laminitis due to the hormonal effects that we see on the hoof of the horse. So this is a great strategy if the horse is sound, however, not available to everyone whose horse may have some metabolic syndrome issues. So if we just look, here's some data on how many calories your horse would expend depending on what gait he's actually going. So this is just, okay, here's a bunch of numbers, but what will we actually do with that? Well, unfortunately, if we used an example of a horse that's a body condition score of 7, and let's say our horse is consuming 2.1% of his body weight, and that's pretty normal. So that's right there in typical normal range. And usually our overweight horses are not usually our picky eaters, so they might even be eating a little bit more. And let's say I'm feeding my horse some hay that is 2.3 megacalories of energy per kilogram that horse is fed. Well, if I do the math on that horse, my horse is actually eating 28 megacalories per day, and he should only be eating 19. So we have a big mismatch here, again, of some pretty standard numbers of what horses can do. That's part of why he's still a little bit overweight. Well, if I wanted to use my exercise example, to get my horse to reduce his energy or to expend that energy, he's going to have to stay at a medium trot for 65 minutes per day. Well, I don't know about you, but I don't have the ability or time to essentially go trotting my horse around for a full hour a day. So we might have to employ some additional strategies in our workload here. So my other option is to work on the calorie balance. So think about calories in versus calories out. So I need to restrict calories in, so we're gonna lower his intake. Well, if you've had horses where you've restricted calories, again, they're gonna find something to do because they're bored or they have that desire to eat. So this may result in some damaged fences, horses chewing a lot. So again, when we think about restricting intake, we have to account for a number of these different items and not just reduce the total amount that he's consuming without making some adjustments along the way. And this can be pretty discouraging for owners. Certainly I've looked at a number of studies over the years, and you can restrict a horse pretty significantly in their intake. So there was a study where they restricted a horse to 60% of their maintenance intake, and there was no change in body weight after a month. And that can be pretty discouraging, again, for owners that are looking to see some results and they're not seeing anything. We have an unhappy horse. So again, we're going to talk about some different strategies. So, and really we want to offer some strategies that owners are able to keep up with, because again, if you can't follow through with that restriction of calories, that horse isn't going to lose weight, and we're really not going to get him to a healthier body weight. So this is actually a study from North Carolina where they had recruited owners with obese horses and put them on essentially a research trial on losing weight. And one of the interesting things that came out of this study is they found that they really didn't have very good owner compliance. So even though they sent them home with very strict instructions about how much to feed, exactly the weights they were supposed to use, I think they had 7 owners that complied really well with their instructions, and the rest of them not so much. Well, the good thing is if you do comply, so our level of owner compliance here, these are our owners that worked a little bit harder, they were able to lose a greater amount of body weight in their horses. And then our level 1 here, these were the owners that really didn't follow instructions very much at all. And so they were not able to achieve much results in their horses. So if you consult with a professional or a nutrition professional, we have to follow the instructions to get those horses to lose weight. Now, some other interesting data that came out of that study. One change that seemed to be pretty significant in allowing us to lose some weight on those horses is actually restricting them from pasture. So the horses that the owners had them in dry lots or stalled were able to achieve better weight loss than horses that were allowed pasture, which would make sense. It's a lot harder to lose weight on a horse if they're on continuous pasture, or even if we restricted them to partial pasture. So that may be a key feature in our weight loss strategy for our horses. So why is restricting pasture the key? So horses are pretty selective grazers. So if we've ever walked a pasture, you've always seen those roughs and lawns, and the lawns where horses really eat the grass pretty low to the ground. Well, that's because the younger the plant, the more nutrition it is. And so horses will actually seek out those younger plants that are more nutrient dense, and they'll keep consuming those and essentially let the older, more mature plants go. So they're really pretty hard on pastures and actually are pretty good at finding the highest calorie plants in your pasture to continue to graze. So what these horses are doing, when we think about these young, tender plants, these are the ones that are the highest in non-structural carbohydrates, and we will talk about those a little bit more as we go here. So again, our horses naturally are going to seek out those areas in your pasture that are highest in caloric content, which may not be the best for them. They're also pretty crafty. So if we think about using strategies to maybe restrict the amount of time the horses are on pasture, that's not always a very adequate strategy. So one of my favorite studies that I read, they actually used some ponies, and they had essentially restricted the ponies to only 4 hours access to pasture. Well, the ponies quickly figured out that they were going to have a very limited amount of time on pasture, and so they easily were able to consume all of their maintenance requirements really, really quickly. So you can see it's pretty easy to overconsume. Again, if you restrict intake or restrict the amount of time your horse has access to pasture, they figure it out pretty quickly that you're going to pull them back off, and they just eat faster. So again, maybe kind of tricky to outsmart the horse. So why is this so important when we're thinking about restricting intake and managing those horses? So horses, if they're not given adequate chew time, essentially if they're not able to consume forage over a longer period of time, that can create a lot of frustration behaviors in your horses. So horses can start developing cribbing behavior or chewing on fences, stall walls, etc. And if we're really reducing the amount of time the horse is chewing, they're at a greater risk of developing ulcer syndrome. So this is where we link back to some of those other disorders we talked about. So this gets a little tricky. We need to reduce intake, but we still want our horses able to chew the same amount of time. So this can be a tricky problem for our owners to handle. So some alternatives of best of both worlds of restricting intake but still keeping our horses mentally happy and keeping their GI tract happy is to use some strategies to slow down their rate of intake. So there's a number of different products that are out there that can slow intake. There are slow feeders, so actually where your hay can go into either wooden feeders or plastic feeders. There are products that are called nibble nets or slow feeders that are hay nets, where the openings are much smaller, so the horse can only take small bites of food out of there. So it keeps the animals chewing for a longer period of time and prevents some of those boredom and frustration behaviors. So this data here is looking at some behavior sampling of horses where they either fed them on the ground of their stall or put their hay in a slow feeding net. And so the horses spent more time actually eating, which would make sense when using the slow feeders. And in this particular study, they also had some straw that the horses were bedded on. And so the horses spent less time eating straw if they were fed out of a slow feeder than our frustrated horses that were fed on the ground. So another great tool we can use to keep our horses healthy while reducing intake. Other strategies are to use grazing muzzles. So if you do want to allow your horse to have some access to pasture and kind of have a more natural environment, these can be great tools to use. Make sure that these are monitored carefully. We don't want to just put a grazing muzzle on a horse and walk away and forget about them, but can help you out with turnout time. Also realize that your other horses that may be pasture mates with them may find these as fun toys to play with. So if you have a horse with a grazing muzzle and one without, the one without may actually help out the one you're trying to restrict intake and take it off for him. The other option that we could employ is to change our forage type. So forage should always be the bulk of the horse's diet anyhow. So if we choose more mature hays, that can help feed the same amount while giving them less calories. But to know that, you probably should test your hay and get a forage report back so we know the actual energy density of that hay. The other option, in general, and I'm going to say this in general, our warm season grasses are typically lower in digestible energy than our cool season grasses. And we'll talk about what those are as we go forward in tonight's lecture. So, carbohydrates. I'd kind of mentioned that horses selectively will choose more non-structural carbohydrates when they're grazing in pastures. And we provide a lot of dietary recommendations for a lot of these horses with metabolic disorders to essentially avoid certain types of carbohydrates. So the key ones that we're going to look at here, and don't worry about this scary diagram, we're going to talk about it here a little bit. The key things that we're going to stay away from for these guys are either our non-fiber carbohydrates or non-structural carbohydrates, and specifically some of our water-soluble carbohydrates. So let's just take a look to see what water-soluble carbohydrates actually are. So here in this sort of pink box here, our water-soluble carbohydrates are our simple sugars, disaccharides, and essentially our longer chains of carbohydrates, as well as fructans. So fructans are ones that sort of pull out as the bad guys when we think about pasture-associated laminitis, and the ones that we tend to worry about when allowing our metabolic horses access to pasture. So those are ones we want to keep an eye on. But really, for our metabolic horses, we want to avoid some of our non-structural carbohydrates. So those essentially would be in this category here. So when we look at our fructans and our starches, as well as our starches here, so all of these constitute our non-structural carbohydrates that we want to sort of steer away from when we're feeding these horses with metabolic disorders. So we'll talk a little bit about how to do that here in just a little bit. So I had mentioned the idea that warm season forages have less energy in them than our cool season grasses. So what are those? Well, it's pretty easy to tell in Oklahoma compared to other states around the country. Right now, our cool season grasses are ones that are green and are still growing. So as you drive around all the wheat pastures, those are cool season grasses. And everything that is now brown is a warm season grass. So for us, our warm season grasses, we have a lot of Bermuda in Oklahoma, as well as brome and some of our native species as well. So it gives you sort of a general estimate. Warm season grasses are those that are pretty dormant or brown at this point in time. Cool season grasses, still green. Our fescues, our wheats, etc., are going to be our cool season. So what does this have to do with anything with our horses other than what's green at this time of year? Well, our warm season grasses actually are really high yielding grasses, so they grow really pretty fast. They don't max out with sunlight, so they do like sunlight quite a bit, whereas our cool season grasses actually do better, or not that they don't grow in full sun, but they can actually do pretty well in shade. So that's why you often see cool season grasses growing under trees, etc. The other things in Oklahoma we think about are cool season grasses are not as efficient at using water compared to our warm season grasses. So they do quite well with less water. Also why things tend to do okay here in Oklahoma due to our rather less rainy season in the summer. Our warm season grasses can still handle that pretty well. They also prefer the heat. So again, you can tell time of year when it gets cooler, our cool season grasses take over. So now let's get to the important part. So these two types of grasses actually store carbohydrates differently. So this is the key feature. Our cool season grasses essentially store carbohydrates as fructans. And there's no limit really to how much fructans they can store within the cell wall. Warm season grasses do have a limit. So they can only store so much starch within them compared to our cool season grasses. So when we think about the bad guys for our horses with metabolic syndrome, we're typically talking about cool season. That doesn't mean that we can just forget about the warm season grasses, just that there's a relative greater risk of the cool season. Now, the other kind of interesting thing is our warm season grasses also respond really well to nitrogen use. But that doesn't mean that our cool season grasses don't need nitrogen. And when we talk about the best ways to manage our pastures, even fertilizing cool season can have an impact into how they grow and the type of, or the amount of carbohydrate that they're going to store. So now here's our reality check. Most of the forage research, especially here in the Great Plains, has been for cattle. And a lot of the cattle data, there's more focus on NDF and ADF, which aren't really the numbers that we need when we're thinking about the best practices for our metabolic horses. There is some information that's out there, and definitely cattle will gain faster the higher the non-structural carbohydrate content in the diet. But again, most feed reports and what we know about forages focus on their use for cattle. And in horses, we're far more concerned about what is that starch content, what is that fructan content, our water-soluble carbohydrates, because again, that's important information for our metabolic horses. So when you are looking at different information about plants, realize that just because you see a forage report or some data on plants grown in North Carolina or in Florida, that may be very different from what we experience here in the greater Southern Plains and in Oklahoma. So I would advise, if you do have a horse with some of these issues, that really getting that forage tested will give you the best information on how to manage them correctly. So in general, again, cool season grasses are going to have more of our non-structural carbohydrates and more of these fructans. So when do we see more of these occur? So essentially, when the plant is going to be restricted in their growth, but not by photosynthesis. So what does that mean? Our cool season grasses, again, use less sunlight, so they do better in shade. So right now, our sunlight is weaker, right? But the plant can still grow just fine. So what's going to limit photosynthesis? Well, if we have drought conditions, that can limit photosynthesis. And so essentially that won't limit photosynthesis, but will restrict growth. So our plant may not have enough water to grow, but it still can essentially take in our carbon and try to turn that into our fructans. We also see that more often when there's a bigger swing between day and night temperatures. And so this time of year, we experience that quite a bit, where we can have some pretty nice warm days. Today was an example, and it cools off at night. So these are prime conditions when, again, these cool season grasses may be storing a rather large amount of fructans in the cell wall. So what can we do thinking about pasture management for these horses and trying to avoid risk? Well, if we allow growth to be maximum, that can help allow a lower level of fructans. So if we fertilize those pastures and allow the plants to have maximal growth, that can help drive the plant away essentially from overproducing fructans. We have to be aware of drought conditions, because again, that can increase the amount of fructans that are happening. Mowing pastures can be a great way to force plants to try to grow, to recover their leaves, so to speak, and so that can pull them away from storage and drive them back towards growth. And then when we allow horses to graze, one of the conditions we don't want to do is actually mow pastures pretty short and allow them back on that stubble, because down towards the base of the plant is actually going to be where there are more of those non-structural carbohydrates. So be aware of those conditions are pretty important. The other tip that I would give is to only allow grazing early in the morning. And so why does that make a difference? Well, overnight, the plant has had to use essentially the stored carbohydrates for energy. And then during the day with the sun, they are busily doing photosynthesis and storing those carbohydrates away. And so they're actually going to be highest in non-structural carbohydrates later in the day, and they're going to be lowest in the early morning hours. So always morning grazing is going to be the best bet. Now, in general, we want to feed our horses only 10 to 12% of non-structural carbohydrates of the total diet. So that's important to remember. We're talking about the total diet of the horse. And this is for horses with metabolic issues, not our general equine population. So in general, again, I would advocate for the use of warm season forages for these horses, but you also still need to have that forage tested. So that's going to be key, so you know what the horse is consuming. Horses should always have a forage-based diet, so that's why you can't just select a concentrate that fits that requirement without knowing anything about the forage. So again, forage testing is going to be pretty key. Now, there are some strategies that one can use to try to lower the amount of non-structural carbohydrates in the hay the horse is fed. So some people will utilize steaming or soaking the hay. And we do know that soaking it can help reduce non-structural carbohydrates and water-soluble carbohydrates. But there's quite a bit of variability in how much that actually affects the plant. So there's some interesting data that might get this to be a little bit confusing as to what's the best practices. So when we soak hay, the effectiveness of this practice at pulling the fructans out of the hay actually depends on the type of hay. And remember, if you're soaking that hay, you're also going to lose some of the water-soluble nutrients that are other types of nutrients, such as proteins, vitamins, minerals, etc. So we may still need to think about the total nutrient concentration of that horse's diet. So here's a table. This is actually pretty interesting data. So if we take a look at this, these are different types of hays that a group tested, and varied quite a bit in how much water-soluble carbohydrates were actually in that plant to start with. So if we looked at, let's say, this hay number 2 that was pretty high in water-soluble carbohydrates, if we look at how much was lost over time with soaking, this hay really didn't lose very much of its water-soluble carbohydrates at all up until they had soaked it for 16 hours. So that's a pretty significant amount of time. And at the same time, they were losing some of their water-soluble protein at the same time. So we don't want to lose the protein, we just want to lose the carbohydrates. Whereas other plants that were relatively lower in water-soluble carbohydrates actually did have a pretty significant amount of those losses after only 40 minutes. So my point here is that just because you are following the practice of soaking hay does not necessarily mean that it's getting significantly safer for the horse, because it really does depend on hay type. So there's not enough information out there on all the different hay types to give us really, really solid information for horse owners. So again, beware, and that's why I would recommend testing the forage. So thinking about concentrate selection, again, we want to make sure that we're feeding 10 to 12% of the total diet is non-structural carbohydrates. Again, refer back to test the forage. With our concentrates, it can be a little frustrating for our owners because our horse feeds don't really provide caloric information. And when we're trying to reduce the overall energy intake of the horse, that can be hard to know, well, how much is he actually receiving? Now, there are many manufacturers that do produce low-calorie concentrates, so they'll be marketed that way. And some other options for owners to make sure the horse is still getting all the nutrients they need are products that are essentially ration balancers. So these are designed to be fed at a rate of only 1 or 2 pounds a day. They're typically high in protein to make sure the horse is getting enough of the key amino acids that they need. And it'll have a higher concentration, again, of our vitamins and minerals to make sure the horse can get all of those key nutrients without getting the calories. So these may be great options for owners to use when trying to, again, lower calories, restrict intake, maybe using a lower quality hay to reduce calories, but still make sure our horse is getting everything he needs to be healthy and still have adequate nutrient intake. So some other items that owners can get a little maybe frustrated with, marketing can be a little bit tricky, is really remember that it is the total diet that is the key that we're saying we need to be 10 to 12% total non-structural carbohydrates. So let's say that we had a treat the horse would get that was 21% non-structural carbohydrates. Well, a lot of owners would really worry about that. Well, it's over the amount that we're supposed to give of our 10 to 12%. But if it was only a 3-gram treat and it was 21% non-structural carbohydrates, that horse is only getting 630 milligrams of non-structural carbohydrates. So that really isn't a very large amount when we think about it in context of a horse consuming 20 pounds of feed per day. 630 milligrams is pretty small. The other piece that can be really confusing, products are marketed to people where they'll say, well, there's just, sugar hasn't been added. But again, we need to know what's in the diet again, my goal is 10 to 12% of the total diet is limited to non-structural carbohydrates, and not really single items, and not really the presence or absence of any sugar that's been added to that feed. Some other dietary strategies that have been somewhat successful in creating some change in our horses with insulin resistance and metabolic syndrome have been also adding some of our N3 fatty acids. So you may be familiar with this from human nutrition, that these are really helpful for insulin resistance, reducing inflammation, etc. So omega-3s in horses definitely have their usage. They do have some positive effects, but owners need to know that it can be a little tricky to do. For one, a lot of the sources of N3 fatty acids, the really rich sources of our longer chain N3 fatty acids, are marine sources. Well, what does that mean? Fish, marine fish. And you can imagine a lot of horses don't really like to eat fish. So it smells pretty bad, has pretty low palatability, and so a lot of owners don't really want to have a fishy smelling barn. You also have to provide a significant amount of it to achieve the health benefits that go with eating some of these fatty acids. So one option is to use oils. So there are some products that are available that specifically increase the amount of N3 fatty acids the horses are getting. The extra processing it takes to reduce some of that odor does drive the costs up. So just realize that they may be a pretty pricey way to alter the fatty acid profile of the diet for that horse. So one of the sources I found that cost was as high as $115 per gallon. That's pretty significant. So owners should know going into that, to get the amount that that animal needs, it may be a pretty expensive endeavor. Alternatively, flax actually is a pretty good source of N3 fatty acids, and the nice thing with flax is horses accept the taste of that rather well. So that may be an alternative for our owners with insulin resistant and metabolic syndrome horses. So again, I kind of mentioned this already. Marine sources are always going to be the highest concentration of N3 fatty acids, but horses may find that relatively low in acceptance, and so flax may be a good alternative that's pretty high in our linoleic acid. So just to show you some data on N3 fatty acids and insulin sensitivity. So this was a study where horses that had insulin sensitivity issues were fed either flax or marine sources of N3 fatty acids. And their insulin sensitivity did increase over time. So we did see an improvement, again, in insulin sensitivity after our 90-day treatment period. So might be a positive way to approach improving the health status of our metabolic horses. Another option that we're seeing on the market now is microalgae. So some researchers are using this as some new products to alter inflammation and some of our fatty acid profiles in the blood of horses. So this is some really new data, only from 2019, where they're using some microalgae to help with metabolic horses. So this is a new piece of the puzzle. So I would say let's stay tuned for more information as we go forward with microalgae. Personally, I don't know what the acceptability of this product is at this point in time. Certainly, if anybody knows anything, wouldn't mind hearing from you guys as well. So to wrap all this up, if anything, what I would say, yes, you're going to have to restrict intake to these horses to get them back to a healthier body weight and essentially reduce the amount of adipose tissue, reduce that inflammation, and help get them to a more normal hormonal profile. With that, we have to keep them healthy, okay? So we have to keep their GI tract healthy and mentally healthy. So we want to think about using either lower energy forages or slowing down how quickly the horse can eat. So using those slow feeding systems, Smaller meals more frequently are going to keep that horse's mind and GI tract a little bit healthier. You absolutely have to know the forage. So again, it's really easy to look at a bag of feed, but it doesn't matter if you're selecting the correct concentrate if you don't know what the horse is consuming in the bulk of his diet, which should be forage. So really recommend doing some forage testing and not getting a forage test that would be what we see with cattle. So actually getting information, sending it out to a forage testing lab. Equi-Analytical is a pretty good place that you can send forage samples and asking to get information on your non-structural carbohydrates and water-soluble carbohydrates. So seems simple, maybe a little harder in practice, but these are just some tips to try to give you guys some guidelines about managing horses with insulin resistance and metabolic syndrome.